In our previous episodes, we explored the colonial origins of the Himalayan frontier and the strategic fragility of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, setting the stage for the complex territorial claims that define the modern Sino-Indian border dispute. Today, we analyze the Johnson Line and the Macartney-MacDonald Line, two competing cartographic legacies from the 19th century that transformed the remote Aksai Chin plateau into the most critical flashpoint of the entire India-China border conflict. The immediate consequence of these conflicting lines was the complete failure to establish a mutually recognized boundary before the collapse of the British Raj, leaving India and China with inherited, incompatible territorial claims in the western sector. While the Johnson Line was never formally ratified by the Qing dynasty, it gained recognition within the Survey of India's official records, becoming the bedrock for the post-1947 Indian government's assertion that Aksai Chin is integral territory. By proposing the Macartney-MacDonald Line in 1899, the British Foreign Office attempted to secure a defensible border, inadvertently signaling to China that the Aksai Chin plateau could be considered part of their sphere of influence during the Great Game. For the nomadic populations and traders traversing the high-altitude desert of Aksai Chin, these cartographic shifts were largely invisible, as the region remained an unadministered, harsh landscape devoid of permanent settlements or formal government infrastructure until the mid-20th century. This map illustrates the vast difference between the two lines. The Johnson Line follows the Kunlun Mountains, encompassing the entire 37,244 square kilometer plateau, while the Macartney-MacDonald Line follows the Karakoram Range, placing the plateau within Chinese territory. Today, the legacy of these lines is preserved in the archives of the British Library and the Survey of India, serving as the primary reference points for modern diplomatic negotiations and the ongoing military standoffs along the line of actual control. A lesser-known fact is that the British government actually vacillated between these two lines for decades, often using the Johnson Line in internal maps while simultaneously offering the Macartney-MacDonald Line to the Chinese to check Russian expansion. Compared to the McMahon Line in the east, which was at least discussed at the Simla Convention, the western sector's boundary remained a purely unilateral cartographic exercise, leaving no signed treaty to anchor the claims of either nation. The 1899 MacDonald Note remains the most significant piece of evidence for the Chinese position, as it explicitly defined the boundaries of the Kashmir state in a way that excluded the Aksai Chin Plateau from the British Indian Territory. W. H. Johnson, the surveyor who mapped the region in 1865, was a civilian employee of the Survey of India whose reconnaissance was never backed by a formal military survey or a treaty with the local rulers of Xinjiang. Following the 1899 proposal, the timeline of the dispute accelerated in 1954 when India published official maps reflecting the Johnson Line, directly contradicting the reality of the G219 highway construction that China began in the late 1950s. The story of these lines inspires modern analysts to look beyond nationalist rhetoric and examine the structural failures of colonial diplomacy, which prioritized imperial buffer zones over the clear, mutually agreed-upon demarcation of sovereign national borders. The lesson is clear: when borders are defined by unilateral maps rather than bilateral treaties, the resulting ambiguity creates a perpetual state of tension that can be exploited by strategic imperatives, as seen in the construction of the G219 highway. This concludes our deep dive into the cartographic origins of the dispute, setting the stage for our next episode where we will examine the 1950s, the construction of the G219 highway, and the diplomatic breakdown that led to the 1962 war. As we continue this series, remember that every mountain pass and plateau in this region is etched with the history of these two competing lines, a silent testament to the enduring consequences of 19th-century imperial cartography in the 21st century. Our analysis is grounded in the primary archives of the British Foreign Office and the documented records of the Survey of India, ensuring a factual account of the events that shaped the western sector of the Sino-Indian border. The Lingzi Tang Plains, located north of the Karakoram Range, were a focal point of the Johnson Line, which sought to include these high-altitude pastures within the jurisdiction of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir for administrative convenience. In 1890, the Anglo-Chinese Convention successfully defined the boundary between Sikkim and Tibet, but the British deliberately avoided addressing the western sector, fearing that a formal negotiation might invite Russian intervention in the sensitive Pamir region. The Macartney-MacDonald Line was specifically designed to follow the natural watershed of the Karakoram Range, which the British believed provided a more defensible and logical boundary than the arbitrary line drawn by Johnson through the Kunlun Mountains. George Macartney, the British representative in Kashgar, was instrumental in drafting the 1899 proposal, as he understood the local geopolitical realities of Xinjiang better than the cartographers operating from the comfort of the Survey of India offices. The Tsungli Yamen, the Qing dynasty's foreign affairs office, never sent a formal reply to the 1899 MacDonald Note, leaving the British to assume that their proposed boundary was effectively accepted by default, a major miscalculation in diplomatic history. During the early 20th century, the British Raj's internal maps frequently switched between the two lines, reflecting a lack of consensus within the colonial administration regarding the strategic value of the Aksai Chin Plateau versus the cost of defense. The 1954 Sino-Indian Agreement on Trade and Intercourse, while emphasizing the Panchshil principles, failed to explicitly mention the border, a strategic omission that allowed India to unilaterally publish maps showing the Johnson Line as the definitive boundary. China's construction of the G219 highway through Aksai Chin between 1956 and 1957 was a monumental engineering feat that fundamentally changed the strategic balance, yet India remained largely oblivious until the road's completion was reported in 1958. The G219 highway, spanning over 2,000 kilometers, serves as the critical lifeline connecting the Xinjiang and Tibet provinces, making the Aksai Chin Plateau an irreplaceable strategic asset for the Chinese government in the western border region. Zhou Enlai's visit to New Delhi in 1960 failed to resolve the deadlock, as both sides were entrenched in their respective historical interpretations of the border, with India clinging to the Johnson Line and China asserting its administrative control. The 1962 Sino-Indian War was the culmination of these unresolved cartographic disputes, resulting in the consolidation of Chinese control over the territory west of the Johnson Line, effectively establishing the current de facto line of actual control. The Galwan Valley standoff in 2020 served as a grim reminder that the lack of a formal, mutually demarcated border continues to fuel military friction, with both nations citing their preferred historical lines to justify their troop deployments. Historians like Alastair Lamb have argued that the Johnson Line was a maximalist claim, reflecting the aspirations of the British Raj rather than a realistic assessment of the territory actually administered by the Dogra rulers of Kashmir. Neville Maxwell's seminal work, India's China War, provides a detailed account of how the reliance on the Johnson Line led to a rigid Indian foreign policy that ignored the pragmatic diplomatic options offered by the Chinese government. The high-altitude desert of Aksai Chin, with an average elevation of 5,000 meters, remains one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, yet its strategic position makes it a vital corridor for China's western provincial connectivity. The Survey of India's 1868 map, which officially included the Aksai Chin Plateau within the borders of the Kashmir state, is frequently cited by the Indian government as the definitive proof of their historical claim to the region. The British Foreign Office records, specifically File FO17/1369, contain the original correspondence regarding the MacDonald Note, providing primary evidence of the British effort to delineate a border that was acceptable to both the Raj and the Qing. The lack of archaeological settlements in Aksai Chin highlights the fact that the region was never a center of population or culture, but rather a transit zone, which further complicates the legal claims based on historical administration. The Indian government's position remains that the Johnson Line is the only legitimate border, representing the traditional limit of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, and that any Chinese presence in Aksai Chin is an illegal occupation. Conversely, the Chinese government maintains that the border was never formally delimited, and that the Macartney-MacDonald Line was merely a proposal that was never accepted, thus China retains historical administration over the Aksai Chin territory. The fluidity of the line of actual control is a direct result of the absence of a mutually agreed-upon boundary, leading to frequent military standoffs as both sides patrol up to their respective, conflicting interpretations of the border. The strategic importance of the G219 highway cannot be overstated, as it provides the only all-weather road link between China's western provinces, making the Aksai Chin Plateau a non-negotiable strategic asset for the Chinese state. The British Raj's decision to prioritize the security of the Pamirs over the definitive demarcation of the western border in the 1890s is now viewed by many historians as a critical failure that sowed the seeds of future conflict. The 1959 White Papers published by the Ministry of External Affairs of India provide a comprehensive record of the diplomatic correspondence between India and China, detailing the hardening of positions regarding the border in the years preceding 1962. John W. Garver's analysis in Protracted Contest highlights how the competing cartographic claims were used by both nations to bolster their internal legitimacy and justify their respective military postures in the high-altitude border regions. The absence of a formal treaty regarding the western sector means that the border dispute is essentially a clash of two different historical narratives, each supported by selective cartographic evidence from the colonial and post-colonial periods. The 1865 survey by W. H. Johnson was conducted under the auspices of the Survey of India, which was the primary mapping agency of the British Raj, giving the Johnson Line an aura of official authority despite its lack of diplomatic backing. The Macartney-MacDonald Line was a pragmatic attempt to find a middle ground, but its rejection by the Chinese government meant that it remained a failed diplomatic initiative, relegated to the archives of the British Foreign Office. The construction of the G219 highway through Aksai Chin was a pivotal moment that forced India to confront the reality of Chinese territorial control, leading to the hardening of the Indian position and the eventual conflict in 1962. The current LAC standoff is a direct descendant of these historical cartographic disputes, with modern military technology and infrastructure development exacerbating the friction along the non-demarcated border in the Galwan and Depsang regions. The British Foreign Office's records reveal a complex web of internal debates regarding the western border, with officials often balancing the need for a secure frontier against the potential for diplomatic friction with the Qing dynasty. The 1865 Johnson Line was based on a single surveyor's reconnaissance, which lacked the rigor of modern geodetic surveys, yet it became the cornerstone of the Indian government's territorial claim in the Aksai Chin region post-independence. The Macartney-MacDonald Line, while never accepted by China, remains a significant historical reference point that demonstrates the British Raj's recognition of the strategic complexity of the Aksai Chin Plateau in the late 19th century. The 1962 Sino-Indian War fundamentally shifted the control of the Aksai Chin Plateau to China, cementing their presence in the region and transforming the theoretical cartographic dispute into a concrete, militarized reality on the ground. The ongoing standoff in the Galwan Valley and other sectors is a testament to the fact that the unresolved cartographic issues of the 19th century continue to dictate the security environment of the 21st century for both nations. The study of these lines is essential for any serious geopolitical analysis of the Sino-Indian relationship, as it provides the necessary context for understanding the deep-seated territorial grievances that continue to impede bilateral cooperation. As we conclude this episode, we hope that the detailed examination of the Johnson and Macartney-MacDonald lines has provided a clearer understanding of the cartographic roots of the Aksai Chin dispute and its enduring impact on regional stability. The legacy of these two lines serves as a reminder that the borders of modern nations are often built upon the ambiguous foundations of the past, and that the path to peace requires a commitment to resolving these historical legacies.